to work out what we do for Habitat 3. But what we need in that process is also an engagement with experts and people and practitioners who are involved in cities. And that's what this session is about. We have a very distinguished group of people who are going to be speaking today. And these people will be able to firstly give you some background to what's happening in Habitat 3, and then also move into a more detailed discussion of the implications for India, looking at what's happening in Indian cities, looking at the ways in which Habitat 2 was responded to, and therefore the limitations and problems of simply making a high-sounding agenda which comes from New York or Johannesburg. Now this is a major thing to try and achieve, and we're going to try and achieve it by having a fairly open discussion. So the Metropolis involvement in New York through Michael Muller has been central to that process in more detail and trying to get what is happening in Indian cities. So I'm Paul James, I'm Professor of Globalisation from the University of Western Sydney, and I'll be moderating this session. And as a person who's a relative outsider, what I'm trying to do is understand what if that individual act had changed the lives of families and people around that particular person. And on the front page of the newspaper, it was saying, our metropolis is part of a process of rethinking things, including infrastructure, which will make life safer and better for ordinary people. Now that's a big shift. And now if we go back to 1976, when Habitat 1 was first formed in Vancouver, urban sustainable development was not on the agenda. Urban sustainable development was a secondary phenomenon. I don't know if you know the word planning, but planning was seen as this off to the side secondary discipline, which was about how high a building should be and how far it should be set back from the road, how deep a sewerage system should be and how big diameter the particular pipe should be. Planning was not seen as central to the future of cities, even though there had been a lot of very important planners across the 1920s through the 1970s. Planning had become a secondary discipline. And now, in the words of Ban Ki-moon, if we don't plan our cities, we will find ourselves having them change before us. We'll find ourselves without the kinds of control and the kinds of creative possibilities that good planning entails. So we're not advocating bad planning, we're advocating good planning. But what is good planning and how does that relate to a place like India, as complex as it is, with big cities and small villages, with scheduled tribes in the mountains, with people who are complicatedly living lives across very different urban formations. That's what we're trying to get to today. So first, let me introduce Alain Rousseau, who's the Secretary General of Metropolis, a person who has led Metropolis through the last many years and has made a huge difference to the way in which we engage with cities around the world. He's going to speak for a few minutes presenting the background to Metropolis' engagement with Habitat, and then we'll move to Barbara Benninger and the work that is happening with Metropolis as it presents in New York. So first, Alain Rousseau. Please welcome Alain Rousseau.
Metropolis, c'est une organisation qui aujourd'hui a 30 ans et qui rassemble 136 métropoles qui sont des villes de plus d'1 million d'habitants. L'objectif de cette organisation, c'est de permettre aux responsables élus, aux techniciens, responsables administratifs, de travailler ensemble, de réfléchir aux problèmes qui sont communs à toutes les villes, des problèmes tels des problèmes de la vie de tous les jours, au niveau de l'éducation des enfants, au niveau d'accès à la santé, aux services de base, l'alimentation en eau, l'assainissement. Toute une série de problèmes qui font que la vie dans le ville n'est pas toujours l'idéal que l'on peut s'en faire. Néanmoins, non seulement on cherche les problèmes, mais on s'efforce surtout d'échanger sur les solutions. Et c'est vrai que lorsqu'on travaille ensemble, on a facilité la vie des gens qui habitent dans nos villes. Les membres de Metropolis réunis représentent 685 millions d'habitants, presque la moitié de la population de l'Inde. Mais 685 millions de personnes sont des citadins, des gens qui vivent dans les villes, qui travaillent dans les villes, qui ont toutes leurs activités au sein des villes. Et c'est en fait pour eux que les responsables des métropoles travaillent au quotidien. Alors, ce travail au quotidien, il y a un rapport très fort avec Habitat 3. Bien évidemment, cette conférence, pour nous, elle est essentielle, pour plusieurs raisons. La première raison, c'est que Habitat 3 interviendra après la conférence sur les objectifs du développement durable qui se tiendra à New York en septembre 2015 et qui sont les objectifs post-2015. Et elle interviendra également après la conférence sur les changements climatiques qui se déroulera à Paris en décembre 2015. Donc Habitat 3, elle a cette vertu de nous permettre de réaliser la synthèse entre les différentes conférences qui traiteront des problématiques du domaine, des décisions qu'ils doivent eux-mêmes mettre en la famille, etc., etc. Et en fait, les résultats de ces objectifs millénaires sont actifs dans ce sens. Paul a tout à l'heure rappelé le rôle que joue Michael Müller, le maire de Berlin. Transfert des compétences aux collectivités locales ou régionales. C'est juste une façon pour l'État de dire que le développement arrive au niveau de chacun des citoyens. En matière d'assainissement, en matière d'un certain nombre de problèmes qu'elles doivent encore connaître, en matière d'infrastructure, des bâtiments à énergie positive, des bâtiments qui correspondent à un lieu où le gouvernement permette l'inclusion des plus pauvres dans la vie de la cité, le transport, le travail. Tout ça, c'est ce que nous essayons de faire ensemble. C'est ce que, dans le cadre de ce concours, villes respectives, et d'essayer d'être encore plus performants que nous le sommes. C'était pour l'invitation qui m'a été faite de m'exprimer avec vous. Je vais, pour ma part, être obligé de vous quitter parce que je dois participer. Je vous souhaite d'excellents travaux. Merci beaucoup.
Than a meeting, then we have to be involved in the process. And that process is going on, and there are a series of meetings around the world, like this one, which will be contributing to it. So we're taking
administration, then they'll be interested in discussing what we are eager to do now. And it is this interest and involvement which has turned Metropolis into an engine for policy dialogue about the future governance of metropolitan cities and regions. There are many conferences and workshops which either focus on governance and development in the specific context of a city or on global challenges and opportunities, but without any local footing. What I like about this session here is that it is different with its focus on both the global process towards Habitat 3 and on the reality of urban India. During the discussion about the post-2050 development agenda, which is proposed set of sustainable development goals. The high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2015 agenda concluded in its report, cities are where the battle for sustainable development will be won or lost. Another key report, the one by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, of 2012, described it this way: metropolitan areas and local governments will be at the center of decision-making and therefore need to be empowered. Therefore, it's no surprise that organizations and networks like UN Habitat specifies who shall do what. So while the goal is inspirational, there are unanswered questions as well. What degree of involvement will be expected of cities? Should this involvement focus on the urban sustainable development goal I just mentioned, or are cities also expected to share responsibility for the issues that were mentioned by our Secretary General, Alain Dessau, the responsibility for the implementation of goals like poverty, health and education? Will governments in all member states provide ability for member states to develop their own targets and implementation mechanisms? But let me again thank you from my heart for the opportunity of being here. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Barbara. The notes that I took down from that particular presentation actually follow on very well from Alain Dessau. There's some of the same claims, but it starts with a number of questions. That is, the goal is inspirational, but. And the but is quite an important but, and it's based upon two questions. Who shall do what, and what is the responsibility of cities and local governments? And they're questions we should try and actually explore today. She introduced the concept of subsidiarity, which is a concept which is basic to politics in many parts of the world, but is not of how authority should be given to those who are closest to the processes. Then finally, a claim. Decentralisation should go hand in hand with the authorisation of multi-level participation. That's me paraphrasing, of course, but that idea that decentralisation is only good if you actually think about the relationship between the parts of government. And therefore, the question that's finally raised is, should we have institutional reform? All those questions are on the agenda for our discussion, but first we're going to get 5 minutes from each of our key speakers. And the first of those speakers who I'm going to introduce is Mr. Kulwant Singh. Mr. Singh is an eminent urban professional with expertise in sustainable development, public finance and policy analysis. He's presently an advisor to UN Habitat India. Prior to this, he was an executive director with HUDCO. Now, I'd ask each of the speakers to actually introduce themselves in a bit more detail, because we need to know about your engagement with Habitat and the kinds of work that you've been doing. But if you could give us 5 minutes of your big thinking on this particular issue, we'd most appreciate it. Thank you. Please welcome Mr. Kulwant Singh.
Well, my association with UN Habitat has been for the last 10 years, and I have mainly been involved with the branch of Urban Basic Services and looking after the work of UN Habitat, not only in India but in other parts of Asia as well. We are working in about 10 countries in Asia, and very particularly focusing on urban basic services, water, sanitation, urban transport, solid waste management, and now there is a greater emphasis on energy, very particularly. Well, distinguished delegates, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I bring to you the special greetings from Dr. John Kloss, Secretary General Habitat 3 and Executive Director UN Habitat Nairobi. We have no doubt gathered here to discuss the theme of Cities for All in the 11th Metropolis World Congress. The opening session is really interesting as we are discussing the Indian perspective on Habitat 3, which is of a very special significance. As a background to my presentation, I would like to mention that just 86 years ago, the world population was only 2 billion, which has now grown to 7 billion last year in 2013. And 2 more billions are expected to be added by 2048. Urbanization is growing really very, very fast. I would say that the world is fast becoming predominantly urban. At the beginning of the 19th century, only 2% of the world's population was urban. At the beginning of the 20th century, 10% of the population was urban. And at the beginning of our decade, the world's population living in urban areas had reached 50%. This rapid urbanization of the planet Earth is really unprecedented challenge in the history of humanity. Worldwide, urban populations are growing 20 times faster. In 40 years from now, 4 of every 5 people will live in towns and cities, and ours will be an urban planet. In the 15 years between 2003 and 2018, which is yet to come, 1 billion people in these 15 years will get added to our cities. Most of the growth will occur in developing regions. In fact, 7 out of 10 urban dwellers would be African or Asian. And that is the regional character of urbanization, which I am trying to depict here. Within Asia, China and India will be at the forefront of urbanization. These are the two. We in India represent 17% of the, I would say that, total global population. And as a matter of fact, our contribution to the urban population is also going to be very, very significant. Cities are becoming more important as urbanization is intensifying, and beyond being a demographic phenomenon, urbanization is in fact in developed and developing world. Developing countries both in Asia and Africa of urban dwellers, now reaching nearly 4 billion. Looking for the nation as a whole, for the country, in the preparation of its national report, in the national urban forums, regional urban forums, local urban forums, I think a beginning in this country actually has to be made now to prepare for that. While in New York we had a global PrepCom, this Metropolis, for all practical purposes, should serve as the first PrepCom meeting for India, really to discuss the way forward for so far as India as such is concerned. Thank you so much.
I was very sorry to cut off our speaker, but what we're trying to do is also at the same time generate a sense of the urgency and get into the discussion. So in a way, what we're trying to do is get into that last comment. That is, this is a PrepCom meeting. This is a meeting which should work for UN Habitat to actually provide feedback to them. Our next speaker is Professor Dinesh Mehta. He's Professor Emeritus at the CPT University in India. He's from Ahmedabad, where he teaches urban management, housing and development planning. He's been associated with the CPT since 1977, where he joined as assistant professor. He worked with UN Habitat in Nairobi, and there he was the head of the urban management program. He has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's in city and in regional urban planning from Harvard. Please welcome Dinesh Mehta.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to sit here, and although I have a presentation, but I'm not going to make a presentation. First of all, greetings on the World Habitat Day. We all know that the first Monday of October every year is celebrated as the Habitat Day, and today is the Habitat Day. So good to be meeting on this day to talk about issues related to habitat. As Paul mentioned in the introduction, I think part of the reason that Professor Chari asked me to be on this panel is my long association with UN Habitat. When I happened to be a graduate student at Pennsylvania, when somebody said, oh, something is happening in Vancouver in 1976, let's go. And so a couple of architecture planning students, we all went. Had no clue what Habitat 1 was, unorganized group of people, lots of, we had fun in Vancouver, first visit out there. So I have vague memories of Vancouver not being a part of the process, but listening to great architects and planners, and so that was really fun. Come to 94, when I was the director of the National Institute of Urban Affairs, suddenly one fine day I get a phone call from UN Habitat saying, we have a problem with the preparatory meeting for the Istanbul. The first PrepCom for Istanbul, 1996, was held in Nairobi, where they had a problem in terms of the documentation that the UN Habitat had put forward was not accepted by a range of countries. Partly because they all wanted the Rio Declaration to become part of the 1996 UN Habitat or the Habitat 2 Declaration. And they invited a few experts from different parts of the world to help UN Habitat prepare. And so I was part of the process, so we worked from PrepCom 2, working with colleagues in UN Habitat right up to Istanbul in terms of preparing the documentation. And just to conclude that story, since then when I joined UN Habitat in 97, been involved with the range of processes. One thing we must recognize is that United Nations is an institution of member countries. Its national governments are the members of the United Nations. Although we talk about one country, one vote. The cities do not have a direct voice in the United Nations, much as we have tried. When I worked in the UN, in fact, in 2001, what was then the fashionable thing to do, +5. So we had Rio +5, and we then had the Istanbul +5 meeting in New York in 2001. We wanted to label, and by then I was part of Nairobi and involved with all these things. We wanted to call it the City Summit. And we had tremendous opposition from many countries and said you cannot talk about this as a city summit because the General Assembly calls it a human settlement summit. The name of UN Habitat is also human settlement program, not a city program or anything. So there was a lot of resistance by many national governments to give voice to cities directly. Part of the problem then was also that we had range of organizations. We had the Arab State City Association, the Afri cities, and we had Asian cities, ASPAC, and luckily through the efforts of UN Habitat and a large number of organizations, we now have UCLG, which is a common voice for large number of cities, and then the Metropolis as an agency representing the larger cities of the world. So we now have stronger voice at the international level. But the similar thing does not happen at the national level. And now I see Mr. Ramachandran, who was the former secretary at the government of India, and he would like to hear his opinion. But in my dealing with the government, we see that the cities are not necessarily part of the decision-making process. Cities, it's the national government that decides whether there is a JNU or an UJ. It's the national government that decides that this 65 cities will be taken for the cities themselves, despite our decentralization regulations, decentralization and constitutional amendment, what we now refer to as the 74th Amendment. Back in 92, and it has taken 25 years, and yet the empowerment of cities and local governments in India is not as much as we would have wished. And I was in NLU in those days, and we worked very hard at it. So it is still, we still have a long way to go. In India, we still do not have a voice of cities. our city association, whether it's the Indian Association of Mayors or whether it's the other organizations, are relatively weak. So I would urge here, and I see large number of colleagues and friends from India in this audience, that cities now need to begin to engage with the national government in the preparatory process. In terms of the roadmap, and a trivia aside on how the UN conferences are organized. 2016, when we meet for Habitat 3, hopefully in Quito, but I don't think there is an official word on India by the UN General Assembly because of some security concerns, I guess. But the preparatory process has begun, as we heard in the beginning, that in New York at the first PrepCom meeting. Now, ideally at the PrepCom meeting, from my previous experiences in the UN, there should have been a document for discussion. At the New York PrepCom meeting for Habitat 3, there was no document for discussion put forth by UN Habitat. Partly because we've had a series of discussion going on in the UN system on what we now call the post-2015 process. The high-powered committee of 27 members with David Cameron and our Sierra Leone President lady, and that the future we want came out of that document. And then the UN had an open working group process. For the first time, large number of entities, UN entities, allowed non-governmental organizations, allowed various institutions such as UCLG and Metropolis and others to voice their concerns on what should become the post-2015 agenda. What happens when you get more and more people involved is that you get more inputs, which is very positive, but then you get more cluttered. So you look at the latest documentation of the SDG, as we call the Sustainable Development Goal. It's called Draft 1 or Draft 0, which was discussed in July 2014 in New York. Now we have 17 goals. So from 8 goals of the Millennium Development in 2000, now the new document is talking about 17 goals. Now hooray for cities and people like us in Metropolis and working with urban planning, is that we have managed to get the goal number 11 on cities. For the first time, the UN system recognizes that cities need specific attention. We worked very hard during the MDG process in 2000 to get city and the city agenda included in the MDGs. The only success we had was to have the goal on the slums, what we call the target slums. And it was an anomaly because it was the only target in the MDG that had a specific number. Every other target was percentage reduction in poverty, percentage. But here we had the slum target. And maybe in the coffee break I can tell you how this number came about and what really happened behind the scene to get this thing. But I think we have to recognize the great efforts that groups like UCLG, Metropolis and others have made to get the city's goal included in this. Getting goals included in the SDG process is the first thing. I think it will still be vetted down because my recent work is in water sanitation, and we have seen there is a goal on goal 6, which is much more specific in terms of what needs to be achieved by 2030. But the city goal 11, because I guess people working on cities are not part of the UN process, we are talking more esoteric languages and not specific targets. So we need to work harder. And this is a call for all of us working both at the global level and at the local level, in national level, to see how we make these targets more specific, more achievable, rather than vague terms of cities should become inclusive when they become productive, when they become resilient. So I think that's challenge number 1.
Challenge number 2, and I come specific to India, is that increasingly, especially since the new government that's in place in May, we will see much more concerns about some of the goals that the SDG process is talking about. And I just take one which everybody knows now, the goal on sanitation. We recognize that 45%, 2 billion people in India defecate in the open. 2 billion people in India do not have adequate sanitation services. 1 billion people in India do not have access to clean, safe, potable drinking water. Just last week, in fact on October 2nd, the Prime Minister launches a campaign on Clean India. And if you see what comes out of the Swachh Bharat urban mission, that is the urban part of the Clean India campaign, is that while the SDG is talking about access to safe water and sanitation in 2030, the Indian government has taken a challenge that they will provide access to sanitation to all in 2019. So in 5 years, the national goals are to reach everyone with a toilet, to have every house with a clean and safe drinking water, and to have our cities clean, no garbage, zero garbage by 2019. So I think in terms of the pace of achieving the goals, this is something that we are going to do much more rapidly than the world at large. And this is one of the things I would urge as a part of the Habitat 3 process that the Indian government needs to put forth in the international agenda. And the government is already working. For the first time I see that a central program, unlike for 62,000 crores for Clean India urban campaign, the government allocation is only 14,000 crores. Rest of the funding is supposed to come from private corporate sectors, from local authorities, from beneficiaries. So there is the whole notion that the funding itself will also become participatory. There will be a lot more. We still don't know the institutional structure on how this will be done. I think it's still early days, but given the target of 5 years, I think things are likely to be in place very soon, hopefully. Maybe Mr. Ramchandran can tell us a little more on what are the processes going on in Nirman Bhavan currently to see that these 5-year targets are met. But that's that's, I think, principal point that we need to make to the world at large, that this is where we are heading. The second issue that we have in India is that the consultative process, and as I said, I was part of the Habitat 2 process, and Dr. Kulwant Singh, his institution, did prepare the national report for Habitat 2. But the consultation process that went on, especially that we need to do, because India is a federal country, every state has a different kind of rules, regulation, different culture. I think we need to begin with the regional at the state level process. I would urge both the national government, if there is anybody representative here, or we make a recommendation from this session, that these processes need to happen at the state level. Maybe my colleague and friend Chari can take the initiative in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana states to initiate those processes, to get into preparatory mode for Habitat 3, get the cities' voices included at the national level, much more than what we did in the Habitat 2. The third point I would make is also make a plea for greater empowerment of local governments and local authorities. Our elected representatives, if there are any here, would agree with me that despite of devolved democracy that we have, we do not have adequate powers and responsibilities given to the democratic wing or the elected wing of our local body. The executive wing, the mayor, we almost have a weak mayor system. Most mayors tell me they cut ribbons and kiss babies. That's the kind of role that they play in India. I think we need to get them to play a much stronger role, and we need to use this session to get that happen. So thank you, Paul. These are my initial comments.
At the moment, for those who've come in, we're trying to work our way through the challenges of Habitat 3, and each of our speakers is giving a big statement in 5 minutes, often a bit longer, to try and describe exactly how they think the challenges affect both the global process and the local national process in India. So in effect, over the last little while, between Kulwant Singh and Dinesh Mehta, we've had a series of challenges which are about, I think, 3 basic things. The first one is the voice of cities, and we've had a number of people talking about the voice of cities in a way that suggests that they do not have either direct voice in the United Nations, or there are complications with the post-2015 development agenda. And in India, this has consequences for how local cities are also engaging in the urban decision-making process. The second basic challenge we're coming up against with both speakers is the existing conditions in India. So Kulwant Singh talked about the 65 million living in slums, and so Dinesh Mehta has now described really what is basic conditions which need to be met over the next little while to give, for all, basic infrastructure in particularly potable water and sanitation, as well as clean streets. And then the third challenge, which I think has come up across all of the speakers, including our German, Spanish and French speakers, if I can call Alain Lassault Spanish and French at the same time. Each of them have talked about the local voice of cities, that is, the power of local governments to generate a place for their people and to have the resources and finance to do so. Well, our next speaker, we now draw in an architect, Mr. Hari Barai. He's an architect from Paris, and he works for USF. We've drawn him in because of his interest in cities and his long-term engagement in these kinds of processes. Please welcome Mr. Hari Barai.
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank Metropolis organization and the city of Hyderabad to give our organization USF, Planners Without Border, to participate in this grand participation of world experts. Well, I have a little link, well, I can say deep link, you can say, my childhood link with India. And when I left India, I was the chief town planner of Corporation of Calcutta. And then I went to France to have my doctorate, and then later on to work almost in the worldwide. As the themes today has been said to the Habitat 3, so let us see what the objectives of Midland Columbia's discussion in the last few months ago. Habitat recognizes that equity is the foundations of sustainable urban development. Cities should be more inclusive and prosperous for all. The need for urbanization model that puts people first and social cohesion, need for comprehensive anticipatory planning, proactive national urban policies, gender equity, and balanced land development, safe and affordable transportation, and better urban resilience. This covers everything of the human action. Now, if I don't want to say anything of what is going on in cities in India, because everybody sees the experts who are coming, and also every day the towers of the buildings are coming out everywhere, destroying the forest, destroying everything. Next. Just a minute. Can you just come? To change these things, okay. I just say that some of the fact which many of our colleagues has already said to you, the growth of urban populations, the explosion of planetary population, and at the world level. And India too has also sharing the same process. This following tables gives a little bit of idea what is happening in 5 of the biggest metropolitan cities in India, where you can see that the slums is predominating. The one word, the slums are predominating. And what is slums? The poor. 38 of the slum households are in 46 cities, 1 million population. And slums in cities is 61.9% in other cities. Well, this is the picture of India about its slums and poverty. So, if you want to fulfill the habitat agenda, what the task before the Indian government? Some of the pictures which many of our foreign colleagues may not be aware, but every people knows what is going on. This is a dismal situation. Well, this is not only in India, but in other places of the world. More than 1 million of Chinese workers are living underground in Peking, and they never see the city. I remember once I asked one of them, they said the difference between the people who are living underground and who are living upper ground, they can see the sky, we do not. In Philippines, the peoples are living among the dead in the cemeteries. In Bangladesh, people are living every day with accident along the railway tracks and also in other areas. Now, though most of the Indian cities possesses long-term master plan, as Mr. Mehta knows very well, but very few follow the so-called guided development plan. I once visited with a friend of French geographers, and we visited many of the cities, particularly on the Himalayan flank. And we are completely astonished to see how the precarious way these slums are being built up. I asked one of my old colleagues, he is retired, he is the Dean of the School of Planning of Architecture, Professor Maitra. He told me, Mr. Baral, everywhere we have the master plan, but 60% development is beyond the master plan's provisions. Our approach to the city building concept, behind all these things, integrated city development and our approach to city building concept is a very fragmented one. Why? We have invented an array of titles of our cities, compact city, horizontal cities, smart cities, etc., and etc. But what it is? It tantamounts to visualize a city like define an elephant by touching different parts of his body. Where a city is a global concept. It represents the total identity of an urban settlement, which is as much diverse as its population. A city is just not a physical form that we can define. We have the industrial city. It has influenced the city development. Now we have got a big revolution in information technology. It's going to influence. But our urban governance system is not being able to take this genius to put into practice. It is here and there everywhere. But the goal, which is that city is an entity, is a total system, never in any of the program, it has been accepted. Therefore, the city is not an assembly of fragmented elements of services, but a total system, and all other components like infrastructure and everything, they make the total system to work. If any of the subsystems is weak, is affected, it affects the city. It's just like a sort of molecular component. It holds. You change the components, its weak components is going to break. This subsystem, as I told previously, constantly subjected to stress and strain by everyday's urban problems. If the stress is too strong to withstand their bonding capacity, as I said, as a molecular structure they are working, a rupture will take place, and the disasters will be there. And disasters is not coming up from the heaven or the earth, but it is the consequences of the actions which we have done before. We do not take the systemic relations of one problems with the total problems. This resisting power of these bonds, well, sometimes the subsystems are quite strong enough and they hold the resilience capacity of the city. What is the resilience capacity? It is to absorb any unforeseen things, any disasters, not to make in a disastrous way. And that is the way to understand the systemic relations of all these components, so that not to develop the area which is not developable, not to destroy a natural asset which is holding your ecosystem. And these are the resilience capacity. We have to understand it from the nature, because if any part of the nature, the whole structure, geology is disturbed, one day it will work in a different way, as we see everywhere in the world. Therefore, sustainability, what we say, that SDG goal, sustainability is just not an expression, okay. It's not an expression, but it's an indicator. We have to all these things, a sort of indicator. As we do the environmental impact assessment, we also have to do the sustainability indicator assessment. India needs large-scale urbanization, but rapid urban development takes place in cities, particularly existing metropolitan towns. However, in many cases, development actions are questionable in view of their sustainable quality. To attain urban sustainability, we have many problems, many answers. Now, one of the things I draw your attention is the Ganges Valley. What I have been involved at one time when the project Ganga purification was there. The majority of Indian urban settlements are concentrated in Ganges Valley. It's a national asset and is a lifeline on 2/3 of the Indians. This river system has now been critically threatened by impending climatic change in conjunction with man-made vandalism. Yes, it is the vandalism we used to do with the nature. And not only the future of this urban settlement, but the entire biodiversity of the whole valley. We are not going to face one of the most serious disasters in India's history, several hundred times more than any of the past earthquakes in India, cyclone or tsunamis. Our world has never been so rich, but it has never produced so many poor. We know, and it is the greatest anachronism. Our city system, city governance, and everything should work to meet this challenge, from unsustainable cities to the quest of finding effective and sustainable solution. Well, in fact, our towns and cities are living today's way of living day to day, but not with a vision for tomorrow. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ravindra Prasad. He has been working as Senior Advisor for the Urban Governance Area at ASCI in Hyderabad since 2005. He has been 4 decades of experience in the areas of public administration, urban policy and management, urban poverty alleviation and human resource development. Prior to this association with ASCI, he was with Osmania University in Hyderabad. Please welcome Ravindra Prasad.
Explained about the national, international experiences. Having been a teacher from the university associated with research studies and the local bodies directly as a trainer, well, I would like to give some of my few observations. Maybe since we have been working, some of us in the panelists have been working together for the last 2 to 3 decades in different areas of urban development, maybe there will be repetition of what observations I make. Well, the cities, as Dinesh has said earlier, are not part of your agenda until recently. Now, until recently in India also cities are not recognized. Only after 2005, to say about 10 years, some recognition to the cities have come, and therefore cities have neglected. And the fact that India do not have, even today, a national urban policy is an indication of the neglect of cities, neglect of urban areas. Thereby, all other consequences that go with that, because they have not been. So therefore, the voice of the cities in policy making, in decision making, in program making is not there. They have been articulated elsewhere, and they are being given to the states and the local bodies. Second aspect is the urban poverty is increasing, 30% as we put it, but it is much more than that. Now, second, a closely related part is the urbanization of poverty. Earlier it was mostly rural poverty, but today in several states the urban poor are much more than the total poor in the state, thereby explaining the urbanization of poverty. Now this has implications of the political will to look at to address the problems, the administrative commitment to address the problem. These are the urbanization of poverty has such implications. A couple of other observations are, see, housing has been a priority for many, many years, because at the national level we have earlier it's called the Ministry of Housing. Now it is separate Ministry of Housing, Works and Housing. Now housing programs are being taken up and are being implemented, not by the local bodies, not by the cities, by parastatals and state agencies. And cities have no voice in articulating how to construct, where to construct, and when to construct this. But more important is, houses are being constructed, but infrastructure is not being provided. Thereby, there is a mismatch between the houses and the infrastructure facilities that are available to the people. And closely related to this is the distance between the workplaces and the houses that are being constructed and are being offered to the local communities. It looks there is a planning problems. Plan does not include houses, infrastructure, living places in a comprehensive way, and thereby living problems. Yet one more problem is the institutional problems. Until recently, maybe 2 decades back, we started the program called Basic Services for the Poor, a most important program, which was probably given a goodbye from my perspective, given a goodbye by the powers that be, either political or the administrative. My friends, Mr. Om and Dinesh, are smiling when I make the comment, because one of the beautiful programs involving the community in their own development and their participation in civic affairs was not taken seriously, and therefore there's the problems of institutions and implementation. Well, implementation is one major concern, major constraint. We have seen the housing programs. The programs are supposed to have been started, but they do not take place until after a year or two, thereby making the infrastructure infructuous. Commitments more or less infructuous. Yet one more problem is the local bodies' capacities. In quite many states, local bodies do not have any capacity either to take up the projects, to implement, or to sustain the project, to maintain the project after they have been given and constructed and given to them. They do not have the resources even to maintain even the limited infrastructure that exists in those cities. Well, unless cities are strengthened, as our friend puts it, empowered, resources are provided, well, even the infrastructure that is provided, housing that is provided may degenerate before long, denying the fruits to the community. Well, recently there has been a policy change, probably policy commitment rather, about the Swachh Bharat or toilets and sanitation by 2019. I had an opportunity in the last 15 days to interact with almost 100 political executives, and the executive officers, 50 mayors of cities, towns, and 50 executive officers executing. I asked them the question, is it possible for you, even if the resources are provided, to eliminate weaponification and provide water and sanitation to all? With one voice, 100 political executives and the executive officers said, it is not possible. No, I'm talking about places where there is more serious problem. I'm talking about Odisha. I can be more specific. It's not possible. Sir, it is possible on paper. On reconsideration, they said it's possible on paper, but certainly not in reality. So therefore, there is a certain amount of awareness building. There is need for a certain amount of generating commitment among the local government, local bodies, by the state and local governments, so that local bodies can take this problem a little bit more seriously. Well, finally, friends, as you have been talking, I'm reiterating what was already said, voice of the local authorities. Local authorities have no voice. I was in a couple of state governments. State governments decide, but Government of India insists, Dr. Ramchandra may concur with me, that unless local bodies' approval is there, no project can be taken up. Now, the plans prepared by the local bodies, by state government, are sent to local bodies for approval and ratification. That's how those papers go there. Maybe quite often I say post facto sanction, approval by the local bodies of the program has been sanctioned. Now, there are, in many states, the local bodies, mayors have no voice. There are no councils in several states. Chamber of municipal mayors, or chamber of municipal council, municipal chairman, etc., etc. I think, to the best of my knowledge, maybe one or two states have a provision in the municipal acts stating that the government must promote, states should promote the institutions like chamber of municipal chairpersons. If such institutions are there, it is possible for them to meet, interact, and also bring some kind of a pressure on the state governments and central governments. Friends, these are my preliminary observations. Probably interact later. Thank you, Mr. Paul.
Now we have two speakers who are going to speak after the break, and we're going to take that forward. So the challenges that have been discussed, we're going to try and start to talk about what that means for Millennium 3, what it means for the idea of the development goals and the new sustainable development goals. But first, let's get some immediate comments from you before we break at 11 o'clock. Any responses, any comments, any immediate questions that you want to put to any one of the panelists? We've got a microphone, please. So we have David. Sorry, David was first.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Wilmoth from Learning Cities International. I wish to make one suggestion for the agenda of the next Habitat round. And this comes from the fact that when we look at the goal of decentralisation and subsidiarity, as it's been put before, and engaging the international agencies in that subsidiarity, we find that most decisions of urban development come from outside the formal sector, both because of informality, because many cities are conflicted, some are ungovernable, some are transborder. And so therefore we're turning to forms of governance that engage business and civil society. We're a long way down the track with engaging business. In civil society, and this is coming to my point, Mr. Chair, we are somewhat conflicted over the role of human rights-based civil society engagement. The universality of some rights are under challenge internationally, and my plea for the agenda is to defend the universality of the principles of civil society engagement, even if we can agree to very different priorities in different parts of the world. We mustn't break down that rights regime for civil society engagement into relativities where each nation state is able to define what constitutes rights. That's my plea for the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a fantastic intervention. We'll take a response from any one of our panellists. I think it's one of those key dimensions where we're taking 2 years to develop what is the United Nations' central way of dealing with sustainable development, of which cities are one of the major agenda items, and civil society has to be part of that discussion. But there's a bigger issue that's being raised there. That's the question of what does it mean for civil society to be engaged in this process, and is there a universality of rights which need to be defended both by cities and by governments? Any one of our panellists. Thank you.
The example from my professional career in project implementation in the different countries of the world. The problem is this: there is a big difference between the funding and agencies and the recipient countries. There is people who represents the local NGOs. They do not have enough power to put up with the project, their needs. And I have found many times, I tried this sort of, it's called participation, cities participation, participatory thing. There is between the government and the local body and the citizens and all the, we can say, the NGOs. It never had able to take place any fruitful discussion. And there is the pressure to finish the project. And there is even, we don't be able to identify the proprietor of the project. So once the project, once the things are, once it is executed, nobody will take care and think. I've seen in Bangladesh, I've seen in India, I have seen in Vietnam. And this is one of the biggest lack, the link, missing link between what little development taking place and how it's delivering effect to the people. And this participatory process need to be more organized, more proactive. And this is, I fully agree with you, it is not taking place. And still now, very recently I was in Albania and I have found the same thing. Governments select who will participate with the project executor.
Thank you. We'll actually take that question into the second part of the session and develop it further, because we can't really give it proper expansion at this stage. We'll take one more question or comment and then we'll break. We'll come back to you later, don't worry. So we'll have one more question or comment and then we'll break, and we'll come back to this discussion immediately after the break. I think it's a really crucial one.
Yeah. My name is Ulrich Gauter. I'm scientific advisor of the mayor of Berlin, who attended the PrepCom in Berlin, in New York. I also attended it, and I probably will be at PrepCom 2 in Nairobi. And I'm really interested in hearing from your side, your expectation towards Habitat 3. You said a lot about the situation in India, the fast development of urbanization, still developing poverty, etc., and what needs to be done. But I would like to hear a little bit more specific expectation towards Habitat 3, since this is the unique conference where the national governments meet to discuss local developments and take conclusions. They want to write down a new urban agenda, and this urban agenda is most likely to be a key document which decides about future national urban policies and funding. Not that it is binding, but that it gives orientation. And so it is a chance for you to have an impact on that development, but you should express what you expect from Habitat 3 a little bit more clear.
Thank you, Relish. We'll take one response to that, and then again we'll come back to that after the session again. So one person to respond before we have our break. Yours? Yep.
Once the discussions are over in the post-tea session, some of those formulations of what Habitat 3 should discuss from our perspective will come. And secondly, I feel in the presentations, those things have come, the undercurrents are there. Cities to be the part of the process of Habitat 3, rather than heads of nations, heads of states meeting. That has come very clearly underneath. Similarly, the basic services has come as a provision, as a undercurrent of all the presentations so far. Maybe more will come as we discuss.
Okay, thank you. Let's break. We come back to the session where we start the arguments. We have come back to first just carrying those questions forward that you raised, and then secondly going to our two experts who will be able to talk more about the economic background questions and about the governmentality questions. Both have been pressing on the first set of questions. The first set of challenges that have been set then set us for our discussion in the second half after coffee. The coffee starts at 11 and we'll come back here at 11:30. Thank you very much. Was go through the challenges and to go through the issues associated with Habitat 3 and trying to link it in to what happens on the ground in Indian cities. And to do so, we had a series of reflections from very senior people who were at the New York communications event, people who were part of the process and have been part of the process of Habitat 2 and now Habitat 3, and people who have views about how that then connects to Indian cities. And the question we were ending up with, having looked at a whole series of challenges, was the question of the modern universality of human rights, and the question of how can we engage people beyond only the cities and also the nation states, and how can we get a national conversation going in India, which also includes people beyond the officials and beyond the ordinary players. Now, we took a series of discussion points around that, and I just want to carry that forward one more step to look at the practical issues of that and to ask our panellists if they have any response to that question. In particular, is there an Indian process? Is there a national Habitat 3 committee? And how are they going about the process of connecting to major players, NGOs, civil society actors, as well as, of course, business and other groupings? So our first step into this process will be to try and respond to that question. Then we'll take a statement from the floor, which will be a statement which was raised with me before the break. And then we'll go to our two eminent speakers, one who has an extraordinary background in economics and one who has an extraordinary background in governance, to try and give us an overview about what's happening in India in response to Habitat 3. So firstly, to our panellists, anybody want to take up that issue or take it any further?
I think the issue regarding the preparation of for the Habitat 3, first the kind of national report, which is very important. We have been in dialogue with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation and also with the Ministry of Urban Development.
But as a matter of fact, the process is yet to really begin. It has not yet started. That's one point. Secondly, basically, and most importantly, the kind of discussion and debate at national level, at regional level, at state levels, as well as at local levels. Actually, that is also to yet gear up, if I may say so. Fortunately, next month, in the second week of November, Dr. Claus is going to be here in India for 4 days. And that will be perhaps an opportunity when he is interacting with the government at a national level and also meeting other stakeholders to really gear up this entire process. I do recall since, as Dinesh said, during the Habitat 2 conference preparations, those preparations really began almost like 2 years before the before the Habitat 2 took place in Istanbul. Similarly, we were also deeply involved in that process, and then what had really happened was there was at city level local urban forums, as a matter of fact, that really discussed the real good issues that were confronting the country that should really become a kind of part of the Habitat 3 agenda and Habitat 3 outcomes. There were also a lot of regional consultations. When I use the word regional, I mean in the context of India, southern states, northern states, central states, western states and all that. And quite a few important states at state level also had kind of urban forums, And subsequently, it was a responsibility which was taken by the national government to host National Urban Forum. This whole concept actually of World Urban Forum came much later in 2002, after the, this preparations for Habitat 2 at local, regional and national levels. On similar lines, as a matter of fact, of course, there are certain documents already on the UN Habitat website regarding the preparatory process. It is there, as a matter of fact, as part of, there are guidelines which are really put on place. They are there, how to go about it. But I would say that to my understanding and knowledge, the process in India is yet to be set in motion. Probably I would say like this, that since we have gone through a process of elections and new government just took over in the month of May, and the government of India, particularly the two ministries which are involved, were more busy in defining the agenda and setting the priorities and preparing a way forward for the priorities of the new government. They have not yet given that attention.
Would it be appropriate for, and I ask all the panel members, would it be appropriate for us to make a claim or a call upon the Government of India, but also all mayors of the cities of India, to start a process of civil engagement, to start talking about what people want? I'm getting various nods. Does anybody have any concerns about such a call?
The only thing is that, you see, I'm not sure who will be present in this Metropolis from Government of India.
What we'll be doing is writing up notes. We've got people who are actually writing up the background to this, and so we will make it as a written presentation on the basis of this particular session.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I think we can go much beyond that. The fact, it's something that I have mentioned, we need to use this forum to impress upon both levels of government. And in a federal state, the state governments are very important. And I think we need to make a call to the state government of Telangana to become the first state to initiate the process of Habitat 3 consultation at the state level. We need to make a call to the national government, and as Kulwant rightly said, that the process has not begun in the country level. We need to make a call to the national government to initiate the process. Now, there are guidelines. My own feeling is, and my former colleague Christine is sitting here, I think your guideline for national report is too elaborate, 40 chapters, and I think it's too much. I don't think governments have that kind of time. There are many other priorities. Allow some flexibility. That's our call to UN Habitat for national reports to be presented. More importantly, we need to also use this opportunity to review the commitments we have made in Habitat 2. At global level, which is something that all governments need to do, but also in India, at the national level, what is it that we committed, what is it that we have actually achieved, and I think that's the first part of the preparation process of national report, and I think that's something that we need to do.
Thank you. That's very clear and strong, and I think we can take that forward. Now, we have a comment from somebody from the floor who wanted to make a particular statement. Is that person still in the room? She came up to me, yes. Can we get a microphone, please?
Merci. Je commencerai donc par remercier tous ceux qui ont intervenu, car apparemment il n'y a pas beaucoup qui comprennent français. Utilisez ça. Donc, je disais que je commencerai par remercier tous ceux qui ont intervenu. Mais auparavant, je me présente, je m'appelle Gambo Mariama, je viens du Niamey, Niger. Je représente bien sûr une structure féminine. Donc, à travers vraiment les exposés qui ont été faits par les uns et les autres, chacun se sent chez soi, car les problèmes sont vécus partout. Et surtout l'exemple donné par le professeur Baraï. Cet exemple sur la défécation à l'air libre, c'est comme si c'est chez moi qu'il parle. C'est comme s'il parle de chez moi, si je peux le dire ainsi. Le problème est partout et maintenant la solution ne peut pas être la même partout. À chaque pays, sa solution. Mais l'une des solutions la plus durable, c'est d'essayer d'avoir un changement de comportement par la population. Parce que souvent, même si vous faites les infrastructures pour que les gens ne font plus ça à l'air libre, il y a des choses telles que nos cultures qui font que les gens préfèrent être toujours à l'air libre. Donc moi, je recommanderais vraiment à ce pays de faire comme ailleurs la sensibilisation. Intensifier la sensibilisation pour que les gens comprennent que c'est pour leur santé que nous sommes là, que c'est pour leur santé qu'on leur demande d'utiliser les infrastructures qu'on leur donne. Et enfin, j'ai une à deux questions. La première est que Habitat 3 est en train de faire beaucoup de choses dans les pays du monde. Maintenant, quel programme l'Inde a-t-il envers cet Habitat 3 pour qu'il contribue au changement de comportement? Et on vient de parler de la société civile. Maintenant, cette société civile, comment en profiter? Comment utiliser la société civile pour créer ce changement-là? Donc, le travail en synergie doit être mis à l'avant. Merci. Merci à tous.
Thank you. Thank you. I take that to be an addition to the discussion about civil society, but particularly I take from that the importance of cultural difference, which will include for us, I think, the importance of differences within India because of major cultural differences with India across both ethnic, gender, class, all sorts of different lines, which make it a very complicated process for having very simple, singular solutions to obviously difficult problems. Now, we're going to move now to our next two speakers, and we're going to start with Dr. Ramachandran, who was the former Secretary, Ministry of Urban Development in the Government of India. He has nearly 4 decades of experience in the process of urban planning and working with the Indian government. And in his the period after his work as Secretary, he's been involved in responding to, as a major consultant, to lots of the changes within the Indian process. But during his time with Secretary, he was a person who made an enormous difference to rethinking and reforming the process of planning in India. Please welcome Dr. M. Ramachandran.
Thank you, Professor Paul, for those words of introduction. Though there are always claims made that one has worked for so many years and has gained so much of expertise, I always believe one continues to be a student in this larger scheme of things. Thank you for this opportunity. I shall try to be as brief as possible as far as the topic for the day is concerned. The first point I'd like to make is the reference to guiding urbanization. This is a subject on which we get lost quite often, and especially taking into account the points which have come up so far. Guiding in the sense that should governments get involved in the process of taking the agenda forward, and also guiding in the sense of the urban planning process at the city end. I'm a little bit confused on this subject because when there is no proper involvement of governments with participation of people, we continue to have urban messes created, and which is the story in very many of our cities and towns, despite the investments which have been made and the initiatives which have been taken. It was in that context that the significant urban renewal mission which was taken up in the country for a period of 7 years, which has now become 9 years, the experience of that mission needs to be seen as to what has happened during the mission, though it was not for all the cities and towns of the country because of the limitation of resources, but it made a significant change in the sense that for the first time the urban reforms got onto the platform of India's urban process, and it was taken note of, and at least beginnings were made to bring about changes, bring about reforms in the cities, and that's a very significant beginning as far as the process is concerned. And again, if we go back to the point about government facilitating the process, it was the insistence of the federal government that cities which take up projects and programs should also take up the reforms agenda, which made a big difference, which also made the states fall in line as far as the reform agenda is concerned. Now that phase has come to an end, and the new government has announced a whole lot of schemes and programs to be taken up for India's cities. And in that sense, in India, there is a beginning as far as the new urban agenda is concerned. I think what has been announced in the budget speech for the current year for the urban areas, that in a way forms the basis for the new urban agenda, if one could put it like that. And in that, as rightly made, references have been made here. The smart cities agenda is there, the toilets for all, the Clean India campaign by toilets for all to be achieved by 2019, housing for all by 2022, and there are certain other programs also included in the process. I think all these put together form the basis for a new urban agenda. It may not be comprehensive in the sense one would like to have it, but at least the basic elements are stated there. In the Indian context, I think the topics which would still continue to be relevant is, one is the issue of governance. Governance in very many senses, including empowerment of the third level of governance, that is the cities and the towns, the local bodies. I don't see a call likely to be taken in the very near future as far as empowering the city system is concerned, because it has a whole lot of political implications. So I have a feeling we may continue to live with this scheme of things where the third level of governance is substantially dependent on the state governments as to what they are supposed to do and what additional powers they are supposed to be getting. And in the Indian context, we always keep talking about the three fundamentals, that is funds, functions, and functionaries. That issue continues to be relevant even today. But I have a feeling that it may not be right to wait for the empowerment agenda to get completed for the urban process to be taken forward. So pending that, I think we'll have to think in terms of how to organize our cities better, how to make things better for the ordinary person living in cities. And that's where items like smart cities become relevant, because if we succeed in delivering what is a proper concept of smart city for the ordinary resident of a city, rather than technology just taking over and technology dictating the agenda as far as smartness is concerned, that would make a substantial difference. And there are beginnings made in various cities as far as India is concerned. So governance would be one key issue. And I would immediately move on to the issue of capacity. That's something which one has been trying to flag for quite some time as far as the Indian context is concerned. We have the local bodies, elected local bodies, and the constitution requires that elections should take place once in 5 years. But when it comes to questions of capacity, questions of taking up what needs to be done in the context of today's urban problems, issues, and agenda, most of these local bodies do not have the type of capacity. And when we talk about capacity, we are talking about professional strength at the local body level to think in terms of the problems, issues, solutions, and how to work better with people. So that's a key agenda as far as the Indian local bodies are concerned. And by now you must be familiar, 4,000 plus urban local bodies which we have. And we have another agenda of something close to 4,000 towns which we call census towns, because only the census, the decennial census lists those areas as census towns, which in effect would soon turn out to be urban areas if not in the near future, in the coming future. So there is an additional agenda which is coming up as far as the Indian urban scenario is concerned. So we should be talking in terms of the 8,000, the close to 8,000 cities which we have, some of them officially notified, some of them not, and continuing to be rural areas, but they have a significance as far as their location next to the larger cities are concerned. Inclusiveness would be a big issue as far as the Indian scenario is concerned, and I think reference has already been made about the increase of slums and the need for housing. Now, housing for all is an agenda taken up by the new government by the year 2022, when we will be completing 75 years of our independence. That's the critical point. When it comes to housing, there are a whole lot of issues to be discussed. One is the affordable housing. The other is a substantial section of the population who are poor by nature, not having access to this basic facility as far as living in a city is concerned. And that's the reason why slums come into existence. And governments by nature do not want to disturb the existence of slums. And a proper agenda has not come forward as far as rehabilitating all the slum dwellers is concerned, because it has a whole lot of complexities. Where will land be available? Who will be able to invest that type of resources? What would be the stakeholder participation? The issues like that. So that is going to be a critical agenda. And in that context, what I would also say is, I think a reference has already been made. When it comes to housing, it's not a subject which is mandated to the elected urban local bodies fully. There may be part of the work given to them, but substantially the work is entrusted, as far as the constitutional scheme of things is concerned, to the state governments. So it is the state government which is supposed to be the key player, and the local bodies can either get involved or be aloof, and that's one critical issue as far as the development of slums, the absence of proper housing for all people are concerned, and that would be at the core of the entire discussion. The point about provision of basic services continues to be relevant, and here the only point I would like to stress is, along with the two big programs taken up by the federal government, that is Toilets for All by 2019 and Housing for All by 2022, I think two additional points need to be included. One is equitable access to water for all, which is a critical point. Some reference has been made to that. That is something which we need to take up, because that will have issues like better management of services, better delivery, and there are very many cities where we can move to a 24/7 process of water supply, access to people living in different parts of the cities, reduction of wastage, recycling of water. There are a whole lot of issues which could be included under that agenda. And the second point, which would be a good candidate for a mission or a submission, would be within the Clean India campaign, the issue relating to solid waste management needs to be specifically focused upon, because currently the discussion seems to be focusing more on provision of toilets, which is a huge requirement as far as India is concerned. In the rural areas it is much larger, in the urban areas it's not so much, but both areas put together it's a critical issue. And by now those who are familiar with the Indian situation must be knowing we are supposed to be working in silos. So we have a Ministry for Urban Development, we have a Ministry for Rural Development, we have a Ministry for Drinking Water and Sanitation. So there are those macro issues as far as policy level is concerned, but solid waste per se I think is a subject which would need a whole lot of attention and prioritization in the scheme of things, because there are states where getting a landfill site is a difficult proposition. Whatever provision the urban planners were making the master plan and things like that, now gradually we seem to be moving towards a scenario where people don't want waste landfill sites located next to their houses, anywhere in the houses, and it cannot be moved to the immediately adjoining rural areas because they also don't want to welcome the solid waste treatment plants. So it's a question of the state actively entering the process of providing for maybe clusters, transportation support, and funding for treatment facilities, and cities really becoming clean in that sense also. So it's sometimes one sees a tendency to emphasize only the toilets parts, but there is also the importance of solid waste management. And the point just made by one of the participants here, esteemed representative from one of the countries, awareness creation as far as the toilets is concerned. I think that's at the core of the entire agenda. And since the program has just been announced and its details are being worked out, I think all this would get built into the process. And I'm sure you would have read about the members of parliament and elected representatives to get involved in the process, which means the mindset change at the local level as far as use of toilets, importance of toilets is concerned, and providing appropriate space for toilets and managing them as one's own property as far as the villages and the areas of urban centers are concerned. So basic services provision, that would also be at the core of India's scheme of things. Then the related subjects like green buildings still to spread as a concept in all the cities and towns of India. Energy conservation as a fundamental issue has to be at the core. Disaster mitigation, disaster management, disaster preparedness, these again have to come to the center stage as far as preparedness at the city level is concerned. There may be some partial isolated efforts, and some who are working with cities may claim that there are plans, there are initiatives, but it's a question of each individual fully getting involved in this process and avoiding the types of disasters which we are familiar with. Enforcement would be a big issue as far as our urban areas are concerned. Some of the problems which have been referred to here essentially relate to there not being a proper culture of enforcing the provisions, the regulations. I always like to repeat this point that national capital of Delhi, 30% plus is slums, 30% plus is unauthorized colonies. So it's only the remaining 30% we are talking about. So there has been some fundamental failure as far as the urban planning process is concerned, our implementation is concerned, our enforcement is concerned, and our larger vision for a city is concerned. How long can one continue to live with the spread of slums, the lack of basic facilities as far as a large section of society is concerned? So this is not a simple subject, it's a very complex area, and probably gets linked with a whole lot of schemes as to what the government would like to do, what sort of empowerment is proposed, and how the people would be, the point rightly made, I would call it the stakeholder participation. Some beginnings were made during the implementation of the Urban Renewal Mission. I think in this city itself, Hyderabad, where the Professor Chari may at some stage comment on that, where the area sabhas, that is at a level much lesser than the local bodies, people were supposed to get involved in the process. I don't know whether it has moved forward or it has come to a standstill. So these experimentations take place, but it's a question of making them part of the process. And in the Indian scheme of things, what happens is, I'm not overshooting my time. What happens is, unless it is legislated or provided for, it becomes difficult to take the agenda forward. And one of the final points I'd like to make is accountability at the city level, which would also become critical in the scheme of things. We have a sort of a loose system where some funds are earmarked, one looks at whether the funds have been spent or not. But it's a question of accountability coming at the elected level and accountability coming at the civil service level, at the local body level. And here I like repeating what the present Urban Development Minister stated at one of the programs where I was. He said for smart cities we need smart leaders on the one hand and smart people on the other. So it's also for the people to get ready, but at the same time it's also for the smart elected representative or smart political system. Also along with that goes the civil service plus the accountability. Only when these two go together, I think we'll be able to make substantial headway as far as the 100 smart cities concept is concerned. In this context, I don't know, there has been some beginning or some efforts made as far as the service level benchmarks for the basic urban services at the city level is concerned. I think we need to take that agenda forward and it has to get institutionalized. And when we look at the service level benchmarks, where the city was, what the city was supposed to achieve, and what have we done, and what is lacking, and who is responsible, and a corrective step as to how the benchmark set would be achieved. That has to come to the core of the essential urban functioning, because otherwise we'll generally keep talking about the problems and the problems will continue to overtake us. So to sum up, governance as a key issue, empowerment, citizen participation, the prioritization of agenda, all these capacities, all this would form part of the larger agenda of governance as far as the Indian context and India's listing of subjects to be included in the agenda for Habitat 3 is concerned. Raising the type of resources required, there is considerable emphasis on public-private partnership and private participation in the entire scheme of things. How to facilitate that and how to make it meaningful and how to make that happen without trouble for the lower sections of society who may not be that well off as far as the systems are concerned. Capacity creation and capacity strengthening, capacity addition and constant upgrading of capacity, again, will have to be at the core of the agenda. A prioritized agenda, I would think, along with what has been already listed, equitable access to water for everyone living in a city. I think that's a fundamental requirement, and the quality and level of water has to be laid down. Wherever possible, move on to a 24/7 agenda, which is possible. Wastage reduction. So all these have to form part of the basic service agenda and the strategy as to how these are going to be achieved. And as I said, accountability. I think this, in a broad sense, would form what would need to be incorporated in the topic being discussed as far as the agenda for Habitat 3 is concerned in the Indian context, and India being a major player as far as the urbanization process is concerned. I think these would need to be worked out further to get incorporated. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramachandran. I think there are a lot of things there, and they are taking forward the previous discussion in a very consistent way. There's no tensions or contradictions with what people were saying earlier, and I think what we're moving towards is a relative consensus across the group of the difficulty. One of the things, however, was raised was that it's not simply a case of decentralising, because to decentralise entails responsibilities, and therefore we need to have the accountability of local government brought into contention in that process. There were two other points, though, that I think we should take up, and that's the question of smart cities, because everybody's saying smart cities are the answer. And what Dr. Ramachandran has drawn attention to, but as have other people, is the question that smart cities are part of a system. They're not simply adding in high technology management schemas for managing complex codification or mass data. It's also about how you make your decisions, and I think we need to bring that up as a major issue, and I'll come back to that. But first, before we come back to that question, let's move to Om Prakash Mathur. He is a senior economist, and I'll introduce him more formally. Senior Fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences, an eminent economist who served as member of the Prime Minister's National Review Committee in relation to JNURM. His earlier assignments include being a member of the high-powered expert group on urban infrastructure, project manager on the decentralisation project, director and distinguished professor of urban economics at the National Institute of Urban Affairs. Please welcome Om Mathur.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Srinivas, for inviting me to this conference. As I see Habitat 3 almost knocking at our doors, coming here this morning on the flight, I thought Habitat 3 has come a bit too soon, in the sense that the memories of Habitat 2, which several of us attended in Istanbul not too long ago, are still very fresh in our minds. And also, to some extent, memories of Habitat 1, for which some of us worked. I prepared a message to be delivered on behalf of the Shah of Iran, where I used to work in 1976, to be delivered at the Istanbul conference. Even those memories have not yet faded away. As we reflect between 1976, the Habitat 1, to 1996, the Habitat 2, and now going on to, I don't know where, but Habitat 3 in 2016, extraordinary changes have taken place in the way we used to look at urbanization in 76 and the way we are looking at them now. I won't vouch for everything that I'm saying now, but my memory tells me that the whole atmosphere in 1976, when the Vancouver meeting took place, it was to express very serious concern on the uncontrolled urbanization that was sweeping Latin America and to some extent some countries in Asia. Uncontrolled urbanization. And the clear message that was being given in 1976 was, we need to do something about it. We need to regulate it. We need to control it. We should not let it go the way it is going now. Very, very clear message that came out of 1976. The two or three things that were said very clearly in that message, and I did look up some papers, not just depending on my memory, the confidence in the public sector, that we have the manpower, we have the resources, we have the management capability of regulating and controlling urbanization. The confidence of the reposing confidence in the public sector. And along with that was the whole policy with respect to land, which used to be the principal factor determining urbanization, that land, the public ownership of land and public regulation of land should be the prime instrument for regulating urbanization. That was the kind of message that was being given in 1976. In a sense, the Vancouver Conference of 76 was influenced by what India was doing at that time. While the Vancouver Conference took place sometime in June of 1976, in February of the same year, India had passed the famous or the infamous Urban Land Sealing and Regulation Act 1976. And as many still contend that the emphasis that was placed in Vancouver, that public ownership of land and public regulation, public control of the land use, it was guided to some extent by the act that was enacted by the Indian Parliament in 1976, called the ULCRA, Urban Land Sealing Act. India had also initiated a number of programs at that time in 1976. The two of them, if I recall, one was the EIUS, Environmental Improvement of Urban Slums, and the second was the integrated development of small and medium towns. Once again, the message of the Vancouver Conference was control migration, do not go to the large cities, develop small cities. That was the kind of a message that came out in 1976. 1996, Istanbul, and we had great fun in that conference. I think Katie was also there, and so was Kulwant and Dinesh, and all of us were there. That was great fun. And it was fun in the sense that all the negativism with respect to urbanization that was being talked about in Vancouver had vanished completely. People were looking at urbanization in a very positive sense. No one was talking about uncontrolled urbanization, even though it might have been, but people were not talking about it. They were looking at what it does to the economies. They were talking about the economic growth and the urban linkages. They were talking about how poverty can be reduced by using the tool of urbanization. A very, very dramatic change that had taken place between 1976 and 1996. Not just that, that was also the time that the whole fruits or some impact of globalization, liberalization, and our friend who was mentioning in the morning, decentralization, that had started globally. We were beginning to feel that the world was freer compared to what it used to be in the pre-1990 period. The globalization, liberalization, and decentralization, all of these came in the very, very early 90s. And there was a whole mood in Istanbul was something that we need to take it forward. There was urbanization, the growth linkages, and we need to take it forward. What was equally important, Paul, in that meeting was, which was not there in 1976. In fact, the two subjects which were not discussed in Vancouver, one was the role of the private sector. If you read the minutes, if you read the resolutions passed in Vancouver, there was no mention of the word the private sector. There was no mention of the word sustainable. These two words were completely missing in 1976, but they came back. They were the highlights of the 1996 the Istanbul conference. It was very clearly stated that, look, the public sector alone will not be able to take this agenda forward. We need to bring in the market, we need to bring in the private sector. And that was one of the very important messages that came out in Istanbul. It was also the time when the World Bank had come out with its white paper, 1992, where the words such as competitive cities, I do not know whether Paul was there in Melbourne, the New Cities meeting, where the word bankable, the city should be bankable, the city should be competitive. All those words that we had now talk about had emerged in the early 1990s, whether it was the Istanbul conference or the Melbourne conference or the World Bank's white paper. So it was a very different kind of a message that came out of the Istanbul conference. Also, it did talk about sustainable human settlements, the Istanbul conference, that we should have some sense of sustainability as well in mind while we are all espousing the cause of urbanization and growth and inclusive growth, but let us keep sustainable word in mind. In another 2 years, Habitat 3 begins. There's a very noticeable shift that we are noticing in the papers that have been circulated so far. The 3 or 4 things which struck me as important and which are not necessarily coming out of the UN Habitat, Christine is right here, but also from the other meetings which have taken place in the past 1 or 2 years and in September 2014 itself. One is the MDG being replaced by SDGs. The Millennium Development Goals being replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, of which goal number 11 for the first time talks of the urban goals, which was not there in the MDGs. So there is a very discernible shift, even what the goals ought to be, and urban has been brought to the front stage in the Sustainable Development Goals, 1. The second important thing that has happened, which really came out of the World Bank, that if the world could reduce poverty by half, why can't poverty be eliminated by 2030? Now that becomes a very important message to the world community. If poverty could be halved in 20 years, why couldn't it really be eliminated in the next 20 years or so? From about 60%, it has come down to 30% globally. Why can't the 30% be eliminated? That kind of message coming out of the World Bank. Also, what we are seeing from UN Habitat papers in the UN and the papers relating to Habitat 3, the shift from sustainable human settlement to sustainable urbanization now. Very clear message that it is not human settlement. World has already become more than 50% urban, and shift from sustainable human settlements to sustainable urbanization, that kind of a subtle change, but a very important change we are noticing in the documents that have now been put in public domain. And the final thing, which is, I think, is the most important one, is what is the transformative value of urbanization? In what way urbanization can really transform the countries? These three words or the four words which are very dominant in the new documents which are coming out, transformative values of urbanization, something that we had not talked about earlier, although we have been talking about linkages with economic growth, but much more than economic growth is the transformation that urbanization would bring in, becomes very, very, very critical in Habitat 3. I thought I'll walk you through this 1976. Half of you would not have been born in that period, but some of us who have been in this, at least we take notice of these things. Obviously, the question arises: where is India in this game? Where are we? Are we an outlier? Are we in a part of this global urban transition that is taking place, or some part of us being a part of the global urban transition and a part of us being an outlier? If we compare ourselves with the global averages, some of the global averages with respect to urbanization. Now, between 1976 and 2016, the average annual percentage point change for the developing countries is roughly about 0.5 percentage point annually. That is how urban population has been growing. 0.5 percentage point, not percentage point annually. As compared to that, the Indian growth rate has been 0.3, which is significantly lower compared to the global developing countries average. So one is that we are not really urbanizing as rapidly as the developing countries are. Second, the second difference that we are noticing, once again, in comparison with the global average, is that our urbanization, or India's urbanization, has been more fertility-driven and not driven by rural to urban migration. The contribution of rural to urban migration is much, much, much less in the whole process of urbanization compared to what the world or the developing countries are seeing. It's a very important change. Rural to urban migration brings with it some kind of transformation, which just the fertility growth or the reclassification of rural to urban settlements, to which Dr. Ramachandran made a mention, these census towns, they do not really bring the kind of transformation that's there. Third one is a whole informal urbanization that we are noticing in India. It's a very, very important change. It's not formal. Cities were formal entities at one point in time, but what we are noticing now is that it is informal urbanization which is dominant as far as India is concerned. And the fourth one is it's being led by services and not by manufacturing. So these are the four very major differences that come out when we begin to compare our urbanization with the global urbanization. And some of the transformatory attributes which we see in Southeast Asian countries in China, they seem to be of much less importance as far as we are concerned than other countries. Two questions have been raised this morning. That what is it that we take to Habitat 3, or what is it that we want the Habitat 3 to do? I think some ground has already been laid by Dr. Ramachandran by talking about the transition from As I mentioned, those programs such as the environmental improvement of urban slums or the integrated development of medium towns, to JNNURM, some focus on large cities, to now smart cities. This is the kind of transition that India is facing. We do not know really the very clear direction that we seem to be going to. We have been changing either too rapidly without completing the previous agenda. We have moved on to the next one without really realizing the fruits of the actions taken earlier. But the fact that we should bring to bear is the reality on the ground is that many countries are facing informalization of the whole urbanization process. Many countries are facing service-led urbanization and not manufacturing, which is really jobless, or the job content in that kind of urbanization much less. I think we need to bring that factor in. How do we deal with this new form of urbanization which is sweeping some parts of the countries? The second component, once again, Dr. Ramachandran had mentioned, 3 or 4 things like participation, decentralization, governance, accountability. How do we bring that in? To bring in these new factors into interplay, into managing our cities, is proving to be far more difficult. We have now the experience of JNNURM, the 9 years of experience, which emphasized on governance, which emphasized on participation, which emphasized on accountability. Now, if only we take a reality check as to what really has happened with respect to these 3, we would not be able to give a very satisfactory progress with respect to all of these. Now, where have been the impediments? If we can really have some kind of white paper on these as to where have been the impediments to participation, where have been the impediments to transparency or involving the civil society, I think that itself would add to the richness of the conference of the Habitat 2, because these would be, we have had an experience of 9 years dealing with these concepts, and yet there is still on the concept phase, we really haven't seen much results on that one. I've been shown the red card, and I think I need to finish, Paul, but thank you very much for putting up with me for longer than other panelists. Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks.
Thank you, Omna. That was a very enlightened response around the whole background and how we've come to where we are. And one of the things which it drew attention to was the way in which fashionable issues or issues that were within the framework of understanding of the time affected how people were thinking about urban development in 1976 and then again in 1996. And now we have a new whole round for this discussion. Now, the one that I want to put on the agenda personally, and it's come up through a number of people, is the question of smart cities. But I want to open it up now for you to put things on the agenda that you want our panellists to respond to. As anybody on the floor who wants to make a claim about priorities, because Professor Ramachandran said priorities are a key. We've got this relationship question between the systematicity, the connectedness of everything, and that's absolutely true, and a number of our panellists have drawn attention to how this is a general system we're talking about, and tomorrow in the Circles of Sustainability session, we will take that forward. However, in this session, we'd like to talk about also priorities. Are there issues that you want to take up as a priority in relation to Habitat 3? There's a question or a comment over there. I should just also say that we have a representative of the City of Berlin who has also joined us. He's the scientific advisor to the Mayor of Berlin, and with Barbara's absence, he can take questions in relation to both New York or also the Metropolis process on Habitat. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for a very nice couple of presentations. My name is Alex Ross. I'm the director of the World Health Organization Center for Health Development, which its specialization is on health issues and urbanization in particular. We're engaged with how the whole Chief Executives Board is looking at the issue of the new urban agenda, which is feeding into Habitat 3. It's just a reflection that a lot of the discussions, both for Habitat 3 and through the new urban agenda, but also in other places like the World City Summit that Singapore puts on, tend to be very heavily on infrastructure. It's looking at large-scale urban planning, on economic growth, certainly on some of the environmental issues, but less so on the social side. That is, the social services, whether it's health or education, how they're planned, how they're integrated into urban planning. And so there tends to be a dominance of, again, this strong infrastructure side, but less so on the social side. And of course, at the end of the day, it is people who live in cities. So just curious if you have reflections on, as you're looking at the new urban agenda and what's going into Habitat 3, is how to balance those two forces. Thank you.
I think that question is quite vital, and particularly in the case of India, where the Urban Renewal Mission has been concerned a lot about infrastructure. So can we take a response from one of our panelists? Or perhaps more than one person would want to respond to that question.
Well, I fully agree with you. Well, if you take the city as a sort of, or the whole process of urbanization is like a human body. And to make function human body, you have the whole system of arteries, which is main two capillary system. So is the infrastructure system in the development, the role of infrastructure development. Now, a few years ago, I came with the World Road Congress here, and the discussions was at that time very prominent. The project which is launched by Rajiv Gandhi, Sharak Yojana. Well, it's a very ambitious project. Well, and this new government has taken up in another way that development should reach to the poorest. And without infrastructure system proper, let it never come. Now the thing is this, the infrastructure, if we leave it completely private and public, I have very bad experience in this PPP program. It must be like that because all investment is a banking proposition. Without return, you cannot put the private into there. But at the same time, the public must assure that the things are diverted to the social development. There must be a participation in a sort of whether taxing, other things and all this, that the infrastructure should be appropriate, adapted and needed for the section of the city or the regions or the village. And otherwise, infrastructure becomes a burden and not a sustainable development.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hari Baral. Could we, Danish, would you like to?
I think that's a very important point raised in terms of the current discussion and the focus that's beginning to emerge from the discussion. My own take on this is that we need to begin to ask questions ourselves as to what will be new in this new urban agenda. And this is partly for two reasons. One is that much of the UN process and partly the habitat unfortunately comes at the end of the tail, the habitat discussion. We already have seen that during Habitat 2, that right from Rio 92, the discussions, whether Rio, Copenhagen, and then Beijing. So all the global discussions sort of culminate into habitat. So by the time we start negotiating the language for UN, Habitat 2 declaration, that was our experience, that there was all that we needed to say was said, and there was an agreed language, so we were compelled to use that. This is something that is happening for the Habitat 3 process, and on top of that we have the post-2015. Remember, in 2015, September, we will have the the heads of the state meet, it's very rare, and correct me, but few heads of the state actually attend Habitat. But all heads of states will attend the the 2015 summit, or large number of them at the General Assembly, where much of the discussion will take place. Now, Habitat 3 perforce will have to begin to take off from there and see the implications of those discussions on the city. And something that I have not yet seen in all the statements, in terms of whether it's the ECOSOC, whether it's the first PrepCom, in terms of what is new, and I would like to bring to the table that we need to begin to look at the inequalities in a much stronger way, and I think I support that in terms of social issues. How do we tackle inequalities? Thomas Piketty has brought your attention to the fact that there is growing inequality in the world. The French economist whose recent book on capitalism in the 21st century. I think we have recognized and we tend to look at slums as a manifestation of inequality in our society, but there are many other forms of inequalities in the society that we need to begin to handle. Can we bring that into the forum of discussions for Habitat 3, both at the national level and at the global level?
Thank you. Thank you. We're talking about the question of infrastructure and whether other issues to do with health or inequality should be prioritised in relation to infrastructure, and I think we have some very clear answers from our panel. Is there anybody else who wants to make a comment? Okay, is there any other comments from the floor? You want to come back on the same issue? Okay. Okay, yours.
Hi, my name is Biju Karapurat. I'm with PwC. I drive the smart cities practice in India. Right now there's a lot of developmental missions that the government's focused on. There's the Make in India with manufacturing, there's the urban renewal, there's Swachh Bharat, there's heritage renewal, and of course my favorite, smart cities. What do you think all of this is really aimed at? What is the vision? And when will we achieve that vision, if there is one vision? What does the panel feel about it?
Can I rephrase your question, because that's such a very big and general question? Can I rephrase it in terms of Habitat 3 and ask, given all the different visions that you have described, how can we think about either prioritising them or systematically connecting them for Habitat 3? Is that okay if I rephrase it that way? Because I think we need our panel to respond to the questions of how we're going to go forward. And this part of the session, which is only very short, is to try and take forward your question, because I think your question is a key point. There are so many different visions out there, and at the moment there are words which are standing for lack of comprehensive ideas of how you do it. And I'd like our panel to respond to that. Is there anybody else before we go back to you? Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we take these goals which are fixed by the UN and by member states more as milestones. You know, the post-2015 agenda has a deadline, 2030, to implement those goals, including the goal to eradicate poverty on the world until 2030. We will see how that will work out. And we should be pragmatic regarding these conferences. I sometimes see too much skepticism towards these conferences, and sometimes too much euphemism, too high expectations. These conferences are milestones on the way, and if there is an urban agenda as outcome of Habitat 3, it is also a milestone, and we need that for orientation. But to implement visions, as you asked, that doesn't need just a conference and its follow-up meetings by committees. It needs, of course, that we internalize the objectives, that we make it our own and implement them in our world. Nobody could guarantee you the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 if there is no commitment by all levels of government, civil society, etc. So therefore, it's not the answer you would like to have. You would like to have an answer, yes, it will be delivered by But we all have to work on it, and let's take these dates, 2030, as a milestone.
Yeah, to start with, what are we delivering? You know, that's the bigger question.
Yeah. Excuse me?
What is the end goal? Because right now, it's like shooting a lot of darts, right?
Yeah.
The end goal.
Yeah, so thank you, Ulrich. And what we might take is somebody who's going to talk also more specifically. So that question of the pragmatics is a key one, and we need to take this process as being pragmatically generated, and we cannot put too much store in one particular event like Habitat 3. But given that we're talking about Habitat 3, how does Habitat 3 bring together in India various particular programs? We've mentioned many programs, many visions. The National Renewal Mission has been just one of them, but there's the Smart Cities Mission and so on. How are they going to be brought together, and what is the connection between them? Can anybody talk about the process in India? Yeah?
No, I won't sort of talk about the process because I think Srinivas, who is in touch with the ministry, much more than any of us on the dais, or Kulwant, might be able to address this specific question. But what our friend from PwC is saying, that where are we heading to? I don't think that your question is the right one, in the sense that we move from one step to the second step, we try out, move on to the second one, because many other things have happened in the meantime to warrant a relook on what we had started with. And that is precisely what has been happening in India. I mean, 70s, our small cities were really in a terrible shape. Not that they are in good shape today, but in 70s they were in a very, very bad state. And therefore it really behoved on the government to start this IDS-MT program in mid-70s. When you move on to the 90s, obviously the contribution of large cities to economic growth has become very, very dominant. Everyone realizes that. I mean, it's a very simple thing. If anything were to happen when the environment started, Dr. Ramachandran is here, the issue was very straightforward. If anything were to happen to cities such as Mumbai, such as Delhi, such as Kolkata, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Ahmedabad, the country would begin to collapse. They generate 50 to 60% of the GDP. Let's bring our expertise together. Let's reinforce these cities, not just these 7, but the 35 cities which really were our metropolitan cities and were generating much of the growth. If we do not do that, the country will not achieve 8% growth rate. It was a very straightforward deal. Now we are moving on to smart cities, but we are still to grasp the intentions of the new government, what underlies smart cities. But very soon, another 2 months, another 3 months' time, we'll perhaps gather some better insight into what is, apart from the budget speech of the new finance minister, who says the smart cities are being taken up to meet the aspirations of the growing middle class. But obviously the smart cities cannot be justified merely on that one statement that this is being, these are being developed to meet the aspirations. So these kinds of changes are that really shows the dynamics of urbanization. And that is precisely that has been happening at the global scale. What we had in 76 was certainly not the issues in 96. What the 96 issues were there will not be there in 2016. And if we do not take into account this process, then we are staying at the same goal and possibly at the same state for all times to come. That would be my, I do not know whether it satisfies you in any way, but that's the way I think.
Thank you. Hari, you wanted to make a comment?
Well, my comments is this, that Habitat started some program. We have Habitat 1, Habitat 2, Habitat 3 is coming. Now, what is the important agenda, which is the most important thing? How to create I can say, true city vision. In the Istanbul Congress, I remember, in Istanbul conference, that Habitat decided that there should be the proper link between cities and region. But unfortunately, I don't find that it has been followed up, because it depends. The city, with more increasing city means, they are drawing more population from the countryside. But we don't make any evaluation what is its effect on the countryside. I have seen one country very recently, worked in Albania. After the long time of communist regime, all of a sudden it becomes, the city people are, the local people, the regional people are coming down there. But there is no program of regional development. The only thing of the regional development is, as I said, the proper infrastructure, adapted, giving priorities to the local specificity, capacity of development, local employment. Changing the people who is in the agriculture, he has nothing, and he come to city for getting what? Something which is nothing. His only capital is the manpower. And his only area to live in slum. Slum is not just an inequality. I must say that slum is a denial to the human right. People have the right to live decently, to have access to all developments of the society. So the government, one of the things I laudable is housing for all. Housing gives identity to the people, but not the slum gives identity to the people. And toilet, it is essential for the health. So we are still manipulating about the vision. What should be the vision of the city in 2020 and 50?
Thank you. Kalwan Singh.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very important issue. Dinesh, of course, raised a very interesting point, basically tackling inequalities, if I may say so. The process that, we have followed in India during the last about 1 year or so, when we were discussing our inputs through the open working groups, for, I would say, discussing on the sustainable development goals, we have certainly emphasized basically a kind of goal on eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. Reducing completely, I would say, inequalities obviously is a utopian thing, basically may not really be possible, but aiming at eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, etc. Also, basically, we have been focusing on, sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation, on which there is also a renewed focus here, also of the new government. At the same time, the new goal granting universal access to sustainable energy. Let me say that, since the Sustainable Development Goals will certainly be agreed to in 2015 September, that will itself set the, kind of agenda, or I would say that the kind of vision for Habitat 3 itself, basically. As you know that for the independent goal on sustainable cities and settlements, initially there were reservations on the part of the Government of India. We were actually lobbying behind, basically, and arguing for it, that there is a need for that, actually. And after a lot of, I would say that, semantics, basically changing the words here or there, finally Government of India has really supported. But if you actually see the kind of whole idea of smart cities, I would like to make a brief comment on that. As you know, Government of India organized a conclave of all the state governments about a month ago. And they released with a kind of concept paper which is in the public domain now. But they are really highlighting in that whole process in the sort of, smart cities agenda, that they have to be more like well-planned, walkable, transit-friendly cities. They have to be energy efficient, low carbon, and increasingly reliant on renewable energy sources. Yesterday, right in this hotel, when I was just opening my sort of, TV, I was very surprised that you see on the TV in one of the programs, they were really highlighting what the smart cities will be like. And they have given some 10-point agenda, which is based, of course, on the concept note which they have really shared, which is in the public domain. But they are focusing mainly on economically vibrant and inclusive cities, safe and healthy cities with 24/7 water supply, electricity, 100% households connected to sewerage and other urban basic services. These are all part of the kind of concept note which Government of India has released formally, as a matter of fact, and it is in the public domain mainly for discussion, not that it is really finally adopted or the work has actually started, but that's a kind of vision which they are really showing. And of course, they are also saying that it is affordable and equitable so far as urban basic services are concerned. So in that sense, I would say that, but there are certain points which were really highlighted by, I would say, Mr. Ramachandran, based on the 9 years experience of National Urban Renewal Mission, that there are certain areas which are really very, very critical, which can really be focused upon, and how to find certain answers for that. They are not really easy answers, but I think the world over, I think we have really to focus on different kinds of capacities to be built for these cities, states, or even at the national government levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that gives us a very clear priority, which is the elimination of extreme poverty within the context of a changed definition of what it means to live in a city, which includes the changing definition of a smart city. Ulrich, do you want to come back, and then we'll...
On Ari, you mentioned Habitat 1 and 2 as programs. No, these Habitat 1, 2, and also 3 are not programs. So on the day after the end of Habitat 3, you will not have a blueprint how to develop your cities in a better way. It is more a reference document which can help you for orientation with your problems, but also in discussions with the national government. So if once there is a Habitat 3 new urban agenda, you can look at it and see if it, first of all, inspires you, and secondly, you have a document backed by your national governments, and if you see differences between the document and the reality, then you can use it as reference document. It is not legally binding that you could sue anybody because of that. But you know how it is in urban development. It's not always the legal binding documents, but the arguments which help you to convince and to find common positions. And on the practical link to the post-2015 agenda, it is similar. The post-2015 agenda is just global goals and some national targets. Habitat 3 will be meeting 1 year after the launch of 2015 agenda. Therefore, it is the chance to have a first, not review, but looking back on how the kickoff was. Yeah, are the Sustainable Development Goals practical? And to do this with a focus on the local situation. And therefore, it is kind of a first implementary conference of the wider agenda. And the urban agenda may specify it, puts more flesh to the goals and targets. And last but not least, regarding procedures, I would recommend that you have your national consultations here before April next year. Because in April next year, for sure, will be PrepCom 2 for Habitat 3. will take place in Nairobi and is supposed to be the PrepCom with the focus on the substantive matters. So, and if you have your national discussions, your national reports ready by then your national delegation can feed that into the process. And we as Metropolis can also do that. If we have your discussion results, we can feed that into the process.
Thank you. Well, that's what we're doing here, of course, and we're taking notes on people's comments, and we're actually setting forth an agenda. Just before we come to you, we'll go to Dinesh.
Just quick interventions. One, I think it's great to talk about what role can cities play in implementing the SDGs. During our Habitat Days, we talked about localizing the MDGs. It did not go very far. During Rio process, we talked about localizing Agenda 21. Again, we have not really done much on that, except we now have Italy and I think Germany had initially supported, but very little work subsequently on that. So there is a great role to play, and I think Habitat 3, we need to really demonstrate that these local agenda, I mean, we do not sort of have the same fate as that of localizing Agenda 21 or localizing MDG, and we really need, within the Habitat 3 dialogue, specific role for cities and for local government. My second point is about the involvement of the civil society. I think a comment was made in the past. And those of us who were at the Istanbul conference in '96 saw that while the formal, very boring, I think, negotiations were going on the language and the text of the Habitat 2 declarations, there was a very lively and interesting NGO forum taking place across. And many governments were so afraid of these NGOs that they were put like, I think, 2 kilometers away, and you had to take a bus to go there. So, and those of us who were more involved in the formal process actually used to go out over to the NGO forum and have the fun. My question to Christine and other colleagues from UN Habitat, what is the preparation for the NGO forum? Within India, if there are civil society organizations in this room, I would like to urge them also to begin the process of the civil society dialogue and how can we feed in both to the national process and to the international process. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesh. Well, it's very fitting that you have the last comment from the floor.
Professor Paul, thank you very much. My name is Srinivas Chari from ASCII. This is a very important, dignitaries on the dais who are actually the thought leaders. Tomorrow, Honorable Union Minister Urban Development would be here, and he will be speaking. He's going to spend the whole day here. Following that, Chief Minister of Telangana would be spending almost quite a bit of time. So there is a good opportunity to inform and influence the process. So I would like to know from the dignitaries on the dais, what are the key messages you would like to communicate, because we are recording, apart from the priority items you mentioned about, which we are tracking. I think in terms of process, what message would you like to give so that this can be recorded and communicated in the form of a speech or in the form of notes to the Union Minister? Thank you very much, sir.
A very good question to finish on. Any one of our panelists?
Excuse me. Okay, well, if I summarize...
Sorry, we have... Yeah.
The reason why I don't take the initiative to respond is I've been part of the government system for quite some time. So I don't want my responses to be seen by the audience here as this is a typical government response. So before I take up Professor Chari's point, just one intervention on the point made by our friend from PwC. I suppose we are preempting some of the stages which one would go through as far as preparation is concerned. And when the discussions take place, I think it's a question of the various countries, their programs, their approaches coming together and arriving at a point where everyone agrees to have an agenda. In that, when the discussions take place, you are familiar with our Indian schemes of education for all. the urban health mission. So for these sectors also there are specific programs which may not really be driven by the local bodies. As I mentioned in my intervention, our third level of governance is not that fully empowered as far as all these subjects are concerned. And that's where I made a reference to the funds, functions and functionaries. I mean, in the true sense of the terms, these functions have not really come to the third level of governance. The state governments continue to play a major role, and the federal government continues to drive programs and provide support. So when discussions take place, what is being done in sectors like that, whether it is health, education, and the overall social issues, what the governments are doing, what India is aiming at, naturally will get placed on the table when the discussions take place, and I suppose that would gel into the scheme of things as far as the development goals or the goals to be set are concerned. So that's only a clarification because that will be larger discussion. The point raised by Professor Chari, I think with political leaders and decision makers, one has to be as crisp and focused as possible. For the Union Urban Development Minister, I would suggest the message should go to him that it is important to prioritize the starting of the preparatory process, the references made here, the consultation process, the initiatives to be taken, and how that is to be taken up to a certain level, and by the deadline given April 2015, there should be a certain level of preparedness as far as discussions and arriving at the points to be highlighted within the country is concerned. Probably the minister should take the lead as far as that process is concerned. He should, amongst the very many things which he must be guiding, should take the initiative to set this in motion and have a mechanism for that. And probably he should highlight a point that, yes, I would like to have discussions across the country. And again, I am reminded, that was at the release of my book where he said that I like discussions being generated and there should be discussions in the country. So I think that way he has a positive approach to that. So that's the one key point which should go to him as far as preparation for the next process is concerned. As far as the states are concerned, there was an earlier point made. I have a slight disagreement again based on my experience, because when the agenda is driven nationally, the states partake in that process. Of course, the states can take initiatives, but when the agenda is to be set, that is at the national level, even though urban is not a subject with the national level, but much of the support would come from that point. So as far as the Telangana state is concerned, I think a similar initiative at the state level to look at the state-specific issues and problems and how those are to be focused on. And in the Indian context, my friends would bear me out. The general thinking at the policy level is that there are very many things which the governments here can take care of. There's not much of an external assistance required. So what is the sharing which is possible? On the basis of international experience or experience of different countries, what is the sharing, whether it is technology-related aspects or the implementation complexities, what is the sharing which is possible? I think that's what would become critical. And for a new state like Telangana, some of the points which I emphasized, which have been coming up, capacities, the prioritization of the urban agenda, looking at urban issues. I mean, I come from a background, Professor, where all through our service, or most part of our service, we believed in India lives in villages, so we should do lots for the villages. The urban agenda was not there. So it's a question of sensitizing the governments as to urban also has to be an equally important agenda as far as our process is concerned. There could be political issues on that because, if I may be frank, most of the votes come from the rural areas when elections take place. So that's why the emphasis is more for the rural areas. And for the urban, there has not been an organized segment also. I think the reference made to NGOs, sometimes NGOs could be very positive, sometimes NGOs could go to certain extremes also. That's why probably the 2 kilometers distance was thought of. But in a positive manner, whatever can come forth, I think that should also become available. So for the state, I think, it's a new state, there is potential, there are very many things to be done, and I think it's again for them to look at, along with the rural areas, to look at the urban areas and what all could be done and what all could go together with the various central programs which are there. And I think that would be important for a new state like this. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have to finish there. We've come to the end of our period, which was, I think, a long and fruitful one. One of the things which was happening, crucially, we had senior people who were responding to a global agenda. They're responding to a question of the urban, as a key dimension of social life, and they're responding with breadth and generosity. What we did, I think, and this was the most important thing, we linked specific claims about what should happen in India and a series of priorities which people made, and we have a list of those priorities, which we also linked, and I don't think was any dissension from this notion, that we linked specific priorities to a general claim about what we're trying to achieve, what kind of cities, in fact, what kind of urban and regional dimensions we're trying to develop. And under those circumstances, I think what we achieved today was quite considerable. We follow it through with sessions tomorrow, which take up things like, I think, for example, the session I'm involved with called Circles of Sustainability, which takes up the systems side of that and how general integrated that might be. And we follow up with a whole series of other sessions across the course of our period on very particular issues which might be linked in. And then we finish on Friday morning, with a claim which Metropolis is making, which is an agenda on climate change adaptation. And I think if climate change adaptation, which hasn't been a big issue discussed today, is not brought into the centre of this process, and that they're integrated as part of a single whole, as we find priorities, then we have failed in this event. But as, like events are not just singular things, sessions are not singular things. So I thank you all for your participation, and please join with me in thanking everybody else on the panel. Thank you.
So the session is till 1:30.
Going to 1:30? Yeah. Oh, I thought it was going to 1 o'clock.
No, it's 1:30.
Ah, I was told 1 o'clock. Okay, we have half an hour more. Wow. Thank you. So we go back into the issues. We'll go back to the floor. Did you want to? Yep, okay.
My name is Pratima Joshi, and I am representing Shelter Associates, which is a civil society organization which has been working for the last 21 years on issues related to housing, sanitation, and mapping poverty. This is really in response to how can we, what do we present to the government tomorrow? We have the union minister coming in, as Chari has said, what can we say to him? I just feel that as it is, there are very, very few civil society organizations working in the country on these issues, especially in the urban sector. My friend Sharad is here, Mashal, Shelter, and there are just a few handful of us who are working really seriously on these issues. If there could be a session organized where we could make presentations directly to the minister and to the secretaries, because since we are engaging with cities very, very intensively on a day-to-day basis on these issues, I think we could give a lot of inputs on what are the mechanisms which need to be institutionalized when you want to provide delivery effectively of social housing and sanitation. And so it would be my request that in this forum, if that could be enabled, somewhere we could get our voices across, because we are working to scale. We're not working in small areas. For instance, Shelter is working currently on a citywide housing project in the city of Sangli. We are working on a citywide sanitation project in 3 cities of Maharashtra. I'm sure we would be able to flag issues which are cross-cutting across states in the country, which could be taken up very seriously and could become, and that could probably lead to serious policy decisions which would benefit the country at large. Thank you.
I would like to add to it that the present feeling in general in NGO is that this government is not going to be NGO friendly. It's going to solve the problem more stressing on the governmental system and improving the system. But NGO need to be encouraged, they should be heard, and they have a lot of plus points like flexibility, initiative, etc. And her suggestion is really commendable and you should think of it. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I think that's a request to the organisers, and therefore you are sitting very close to one of the major organisers, and that can be put into the process. You want to have a response?
Not so much on that, but from
Going
what
back?
Dr. Ramchandran talked about the role of the state governments. And while he felt that the And it's true that the UN processes are all about member states and national governments. But I think in a federal country, we really need national government to recognize that the states are integral part of the union. The present government particularly believes that the states need to take on more responsibilities than the central government in the past. I have lived in the state where the current Prime Minister was the Chief Minister, and we know what happened at the state level and how the various state priorities often are different than the national priorities and still being implemented. So I think we need to evolve a process even for the Habitat 3 discussions. While the Chief Minister is here, I would urge the organizers to also begin the discussion process for Habitat 3 at the state level, identify, and the national government has to take into account what the various states have to say. The second thing is that these processes, and the reason I mentioned civil society is that the processes need not remain government driven. That the government has a committee and you only get, if you are a member of that committee, only then your voices are heard. I don't know how many in this audience get messages from the Prime Minister's office, but every week on my cell phone, I get a message, text message and an email from the Prime Minister's office about the range of things that are happening in the country. And this was the process that was happening in the state. And I think that using social media, using connectivity to the people, and when I mentioned civil society, I meant our organized groups such as Pratima and Sharad and their organization, but I also mean people at large. How do we get social media, the Twitters? I know somebody's tweeting about this session because I get messages saying you are being tweeted and somebody's retweeting. So there is Chari, one tweeter here. But I think that we need to use this social media in the Habitat 3 process of consultation within the country. We are sitting in a place which is the high-tech, or what do you call this? Cyberabad. This is the IT hub of this country. This is the IT hub. Can we not think at the end of this conference how the social media will be used by the state of Hyderabad, by the national government, to involve people, to involve the civil society in the Habitat 3 process? Thank you.
Thank you. I want to give you an example from Germany. Of course, we are interested, and we asked the government to launch also this process in Germany. The discussion with the regional level, which is the state level here, the local level, under involvement of civil society organizations and other non-state actors. But we don't wait for it, that the government gets started. We are active on our own. So via Metropolis, we are engaged in the habitat preparation, for example. And what you said about the session, as an NGO, you can start by discussing, first of all, among yourself, and then invite politicians, or build a network of organizations with politicians. There is a proposal under discussion to have two events. One is an information event, friendly information for these habitats. What are the options? We have the experience of people who attended Habitats 1 and 2. It's certainly essential to use this experience to make Habitat a better one. And then in between, and at the end, in 2016, before Habitat 3, could be a second national event where the conclusions of the different discussions on local, regional, national level are combined into a message which is given to the delegation which will attend Habitat 3. So, and in between, you can do all kinds of things. You can have studies, you can have technical workshops which train how does it work, integrated governance, according to the Sustainable Development Goals at local level, or whatever. Yeah, the United Nations don't give clear guidelines how it has to be done. This is up to the member states and the actors there to organize it.
Thank
And
you.
that's freedom. Yeah, it's subsidiarity.
Thank you. We'll come to you in a second. Any other questions from anybody else who hasn't asked one before? Anybody who hasn't asked a question before or made a comment before? Okay, we've got somebody in the
Hello
front.
everyone, I'm Sridhar from TREDA, Telangana Real Estate Developers Association, and I also head Alumni Association, Indian School of Business Hyderabad chapter. Sir, though from engineering background, we are more into developer centric, like real estate investment centric. So the latest hot topic is smart cities now. So we need to look at a few of the things, like Mr. Chari from ASCII is also telling what we can suggest to the government, whether it is state government or central government. There are a couple of issues, sir, like simplification of master plans, like we can give color coding to them, and probably all local bodies can also get dissolved when cities are involved, because we are looking at globalization. And the second would be land pooling scheme. So what are the incentives state government and central government can offer when land pooling is done? Because right now the policies are still under the process. They are not in use particularly in most of the states. And we need to have a lot of radical changes and reforms as far as planning, implementation, and getting approvals are concerned, because there is a lot of land available, particularly when you look at Hyderabad. Hyderabad is famous because there is surplus land. We have the biggest outer ring road compared to any other city in the country. This is say about 152 kilometers wide, 500 feet wide. So the kind of infrastructure we have, so to get it into optimum utilization, we need to in fact race ahead against the time. And of course, the things like quickness to get information from urban development and municipal administration. So these are the things we are looking forward to. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. They're very good suggestions. Anybody want to respond to any of those?
In fact, one comment I wanted to make for the previous question, which, Pratima Joshi had raised regarding the involvement of the NGO itself. And I think thanks to Dinesh reminding us of NGO forum process, which was there during the Habitat 2. I would like to say that, you see, this government, new government of India, has set a target of providing sanitation facilities to everyone by 2019, which means, if we calculate, constructing 50,000 toilets per day, and setting a target for 2022 for, I would say, providing a dwelling unit to everyone, which means constructing 2 million houses per year. It is not something which the national government can do it. It's not something which state government or local governments can do it. Part of it is not their agenda at all. It's where, as a matter of fact, NGOs, civil society organizations, community-based organizations have to really set the ball in motion and start the process, seeing these goals, and perhaps, I think, give a plan. To be honest with you, the Ministry of Urban Development or Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, they are still struggling to prepare a kind of strategy how to really go about the steps that need to be taken. And there is a great role for civil society organizations in that. And that's the message which we really need to convey tomorrow when the minister is here. I would appreciate in case actually the organizers can prepare a summary of today's say, one-pager or two-pager as an essence and shared with the minister tomorrow on that, because that will be the only way, perhaps I think really, to convey that message. Fortunately, Government of India is celebrating World Habitat Day on 9th, which of course falls today, but today being a holiday, more like a national holiday, it's time where perhaps I think the minister can set the ball in motion with respect to the preparation part, which I think I would fully agree with what Ramachandran said with respect to, enabling the minister to really, prepare him for the process to be started. There is a need for involvement and engagement of the academia in this process, very particularly, because it's not just the bureaucratic game, it's also to, really understand that process and start that. And I think that's where perhaps I think there is a lot
Thank
of
you.
role for others.
It's not a direct response to your question or to your suggestion, but it's very strong support, I think, from the whole panel to that engagement. Hari.
One of my suggestions, perhaps I don't know, because I'm not very much connected with the Indian system because I left about some 40 years, or more than that. The questions of public-private participations, in which I come to Pratima, that what I have seen, I myself belong to two national NGOs. One is working with the slum, the ecological structuring of the slums and things, and another is ISOCARP, it is mostly on urban development. The thing is this, the difficulty of the NGOs is the fund. Until and unless this PP project involved NGOs, so that because they are more connected to the grassroots problems, they know how to do this thing, they know where the things are needed. And then in that case, urban development process would be a more fruitful one. And secondly, in each project which I have involved with, I tried to involve the education department. It is the fundamental, the education started from the beginning base to get one person from here said that sensibilization. And the government, I heard the other Prime Minister's speech, that it must be that everybody should participate, and to make everybody to participate until and unless the education make them. It's a long time process, but the fruits will be much more sustainable than unsustainable product which we are going to do. So these are the two things I want to say, that PPP should involve more of the NGOs, which have got much more concept of the grassroots problems, the way to execute, the way to maintain, and the second is that educations at every level. The lady from Africa, I understand the problem. When I worked in 3 projects in Senegal and in Gabon and all these areas, that is the fundamental. They have the ladies in Africa, they are very, very dynamic, like the Vietnam. They can, once they are convinced, they can do the government to do the things. And so I believe much more the involvement of the ladies' organization in the urban development process, and they know how to do these things. The NGOs' involvement, more power by the government to project implementation, not big tower, but from the elementary stage, right? And the third is the education. If these 3 things can be combined, and this is my message to the minister perhaps, would help to achieve the goals much more sustainably rather than just by the process of conversation.
Thank you. Ravindra.
Just a couple of observations about civil society participation. I think we have been working for the last 2-3 decades on that, but experience is not so happy. Reason is either the governments distrust or mistrust the NGOs, or the urban political elite or even state political elite do not like to have counter centers of power, they think, within courts, they think. Therefore, we have to, civil society organizations need to go a little bit more cautiously in approaching the government because they have their own reasons. Second is, as Ramchandran has said, we have, as part of the Urban Renewal Mission, there are Ward Sabhas and even 74th Amendment Act, Ward Sabhas and Area Sabhas. I do not think in any state, to the best of my knowledge, which are basically civil society organizations to represent the government plan and so on and so forth, have taken shape. In some states, the even law has not been passed. In one of the states, when law was passed, every MLA wanted in the consultations that their representative must be there in every one of these ward sabhas, area sabhas, thereby thinking that our other power centers should not take place. So, well, the experience in the past of working with basic services program was excellent, I would say. Slum people participating not only in slum upgradation, but also in the developmental process in the city. But NGOs, civil societies, I think the governments are very, very reluctant, if I can take the task, that view, that reluctant to associate. Therefore, we have to move a little bit more carefully in dealing with them. Thank you.
Thank you. I think what we've done is reinforce the civil society connection, but we've also redefined public-private partnerships. That is, in the discussion that just happened with our two colleagues, both of them made representation around the idea that public-private partnerships are not simply contracts between a government and a corporation, but they also involve other groups like NGOs, civil society groups. They involve the cities themselves, and so that becomes an important part of that process. We have one last comment from the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to join the panel and reinforce the message on participation. Again, participation is key. We need to engage civil society, academia, grassroots, women and young people, because young people are those who will be affected by what will be decided in Habitat 3. And that has to start at the country level. So I would like to encourage all of you to actually really start at your own level and join hands at the state level, at the city level, at all level you can find. I must say that Habitat 2 was innovative in terms of participation. It was the first UN conference where actually there was a committee where non-governmental partners could actually pass text to member states in a room to influence the habitat agenda. So it was innovative. Though, yet the implementation of the habitat agenda has been weak, and we have been all disappointed by that. So now we have to think about implementation and a more innovative participation. We have a mechanism which is the World Urban Campaign. I'm the project leader for this project at UN Habitat. And the World Urban Campaign is putting a proposal of General Assembly of Partners. So we are thinking of the next level, and the Secretary General of the conference is going to receive that proposal very soon and put it forward to the member states. And there we will have a very strong process. But of course we have to think of the social media, of other mechanisms, not only involving organizations which are accredited to ECOSOC and such organizations, but also the public, and how we can involve the young people through social media and other mechanisms. I'm going to make a presentation this afternoon at 2:30 on the process, and in fact I'm going to follow a bit what Professor Mathur took you through from Habitat 1, Habitat 2, Habitat 3. We really have to go back to the first conference and see what has happened and are we going to proceed on having an implementable agenda, not only a paper, a white paper, and a non-binding document. We need to go further to make sure that the new urban agenda is really an implementable document with all stakeholders participating in that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've come full circle. I think it's best to finish with those words rather than to go back to our panelists, because the World Urban Campaign is part of that process which brings together a major
international organisation into connection with lots of NGOs. It carries forward the discussion that we had around civil society, and it means it gives you both a very practical but also a global sense of engagement. A local connection, which means that we can have discussions like this around India, but also ways of connecting it to the future and to a longer term process which will not be stymied, will not be limited to simply Habitat 3. Habitat 3 is very important. Habitat 3 is one of the steps along the way, but what happens in the lead to it and what happens in the discussions like this and through groups like you in Habitat and Metropolis as they join together with other groups like ICLEI and so on and local NGOs will make the biggest difference. So thank you all, and please join with me in thanking our panellists.